Pain was the only thing that was real. It was a sun in the center of his body, a hot, angry star that burned in his side where the bullet had gone in. From that sun, red rivers of fire ran to every part of him. They ran up his chest, where cracked ribs grated against each other with a sound like grinding stones every time he hitched himself forward. They ran down his legs, which were numb and useless things he dragged behind him. They ran up into his arms, which screamed with the strain of pulling his own dead weight over the unforgiving rock of the Wyoming high country. Jedediah Stone tasted blood and dirt. The mix was so constant he had forgotten what clean air felt like in his lungs. He was crawling. For how long? He did not know. The sun had risen and fallen at least once, maybe twice. Time had become a blur of agony, and a single, stubborn refusal to die. The wind was a living thing up here. It came down from the peaks with a howl, a predator that tore at his thin shirt and sank its teeth deep into his bones. It wanted the last bit of warmth he had. It wanted to pick him clean. The land itself was his enemy. The ground was a bed of shale and granite, sharp-edged and cruel. It had ripped his trousers to shreds, and his knees were raw meat. His hands, calloused and tough from years of rope and rain, were torn and bleeding, leaving slick, dark smears on the stone with every forward pull. He would find a handhold, brace himself, and drag his body a few inches. Then he would collapse, his cheek pressed to the cold ground, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The sky above was a vast, empty blue, a canvas of profound indifference. It did not care if he lived or died. No one did. His mind was a fever swamp. Thoughts came and went like ghosts in a fog. He saw the faces of the men who had ambushed him, their cruel smiles illuminated by a muzzle flash. He saw a stampede, a river of horns and hooves that had almost taken him a year ago. He saw his father's grim, disappointed face. These images were torment, splinters of a hard life. They offered nothing but regret. He tried to push them away, but they clung to him, heavy as a wet blanket. But through the fever, through the pain and the swirling, broken memories, one thing held clear. It was not a thought, not really. It was a feeling, a patch of sunlight on a forest floor, the sound of a girl's laughter, easy and true, carried on a summer breeze, the scent of pine needles warming in the sun, mixed with the sweet, faint perfume of wild roses. Ilara. Her name was a balm on his raw soul. He was not thinking of her, not in a way that made any sense. He was not crawling to find her. He had not seen her in 5 years. Not since the day she had stood on the porch of her father's ranch, her hands clenched in the fabric of her dress, and told him she was to marry Marcus Blackwood. The name had felt like a stone in his gut. Blackwood was old money, a man who owned half the valley and had a soul as empty as a banker's heart. He remembered the look on her face, a carefully constructed mask of cold decision that did not quite hide the panic in her eyes. He had asked her why. She had given him no real answer. She had just looked away. And in that moment, she had shattered the world he thought they were going to build. He had left the valley that same day, riding until his horse was spent, putting as much distance as he could between himself and the woman who had ripped the heart from his chest. He had hated her then. He had spent 5 years nursing that hate, letting it harden him, turning it into a shield against the world. But now, with his life bleeding out onto the cold stone, the hate was gone. It had burned away, leaving only the memory of what came before. The good part, the part where she was his and he was hers. And with that memory came another. A place, a broken-down line shack, high up in the foothills. It had been abandoned for years, its roof sagging, its windows empty eyes. But they had found it one day. On a long ride, she had traced a line in the dust on the floor. "We could fix this up," she had said, her voice full of dreams. "A place just for us, away from everything." They had talked about it for hours, planning a new roof, a stone hearth, a porch where they could watch the sunset. It was a foolish, youthful dream. But it had been their dream. That was where he was going. He did not know why. He did not know who lived there now. If anyone, it was just a direction, a point on a map of pain. It was the last place on earth he had ever felt safe, the last place where the world had made sense. His arms trembled, the muscles jumping with exhaustion. The encroaching darkness at the edge of his vision grew thicker. He could just let go. It would be so easy to stop pulling, to let the cold take him, to sleep. But then he smelled it again, faint on the wind, pine, and he thought he heard, in the howling of the wind, the echo of a girl's laugh. He gritted his teeth, spat a mouthful of bloody dust, and pulled himself forward another inch. Inside that very cabin, Elora Blackwood ran a soft cloth over the polished surface of a heavy pine table. The movement was practiced, automatic. Her reflection looked back at her from the gleaming wood. A woman's face, pale and still, framed by dark hair pulled back severely. There were shadows under her eyes that had not been there 5 years ago. The cabin was no longer a dilapidated shack. It was a monument to her husband's wealth and ego. The logs had been replaced, the gaps chinked tight against the wind. The floor was made of wide, polished planks, partly covered by a thick bear pelt rug that Marcus had shot himself. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a fire roared in its hearth, throwing warmth that never seemed to reach her. The furniture was heavy, dark, and expensive. A locked gun cabinet stood against the far wall, its glass front displaying a collection of rifles and shotguns that were more for show than for use. It was a beautiful place, a perfect mountain retreat. And it was her prison, a gilded cage, as the book said. She was a bride, but she felt like a piece of property, as carefully curated and displayed as the mounted deer head above the mantelpiece. She was Mrs. Marcus Blackwood, a title that had cost her everything. Her days were marked by a quiet, lonely routine. She would wake, tend the fire, prepare meals she mostly ate alone, and clean the cabin until it shone, though there was never any dust. The silence was her constant companion. It was a heavy, oppressive thing, broken only by the crackle of the fire or the moan of the wind in the pines. The silence gave her too much time to think, and her thoughts always drifted to the same place, back 5 years. She thought of Jedediah Stone. She thought of him more than was safe, more than was wise. She remembered a boy with eyes the color of a summer sky and hands that were calloused from work, but gentle when they touched her. He had not owned anything but the horse he rode and the saddle on its back, but he had promised her a lifetime of sunrises, a home built with his own 2 hands, and she had believed him. She had loved him with the fierce, uncomplicated certainty of youth. The memory that haunted her most was the one he shared, the day she had ended it. She could still see the look on his face. First, confusion, as if she were speaking a language he did not understand. Then, a slow, dawning comprehension that was worse than any anger. It was a look of profound betrayal, of a trust so completely broken it could never be mended. She had wanted to scream the truth at him. She had wanted to tell him about her father's gambling debts, the ones Marcus had so conveniently bought up. She had wanted to explain the choice Marcus had given her, laid out with the cold precision of a businessman closing a deal. Marry him, or he would see her father in prison and her family thrown from their land with nothing. He had smiled when he said it, a thin, cruel smile that never reached his eyes. He had known she would say yes. He had coveted her for years, and he had finally found a way to purchase her. She could not tell Jed. She knew his temper, his fierce, reckless pride. He would have gone after Marcus, and Marcus would have had him killed without a second thought. And so she had broken Jed's heart to save his life. She had let him believe she was shallow, that she had chosen wealth over love. She had watched him ride away, and a part of her had died that day. She had done her duty. She had saved her family. But in doing so, she had condemned herself to this life of quiet desperation, married to a man she feared, haunted by the ghost of a boy with honest eyes. A sound from outside broke through her reverie, a scratching, a frantic, desperate scrabbling at the heavy oak door. Her breath caught in her throat. Her first thought was of a bear, awakened too early from its slumber, or a hungry wolf. The deep woods were just beyond the clearing, and the animals were a constant presence. Her heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She moved quickly, her hands sure as she slid the heavy iron bar across the door. Securing it in its brackets, she waited, listening, her body rigid with fear. The scratching stopped, but then a new sound cut through the whine of the wind, a low moan. It was not the sound of any animal she knew. It was a sound of pure misery, and it was undeniably human. For a moment, she did nothing, her hand pressed to her chest. Her husband had warned her about vagrants, desperate men who wandered the mountains. Never open the door to a stranger. He had commanded her, "You shoot through the door first and ask questions of the body later." It was his way, the safe way. But the sound came again, weaker this time, a ragged exhalation of pain that seemed to suck all the air from the room. She could not just leave someone out there. The temperature was dropping, and the sky had the gray, heavy look of snow. To leave someone out in that would be a death sentence. Compassion, a feeling she had not had cause to exercise in a long time, flickered inside her lonely heart. It was a reckless impulse, a rebellion against the cold, hard logic of her life. Before she could change her mind, she lifted the heavy bar, turned the iron handle, and pulled the door inward just a crack. The world seemed to stop. The wind, the fire, the frantic beating of her own heart. It all went silent. Collapsed on her doorstep was a man, or what was left of one. He was a ruin, a creature of mud and blood and tattered cloth. He was half dead, his face gaunt and covered in a dirty, matted beard. But as her eyes adjusted to the shape of him, something familiar snagged at her memory. The broad set of his shoulders, even slumped in defeat, the line of his jaw beneath the grime. Her eyes widened in disbelief. It was impossible. It could not be. Through a red haze of pain, Jed saw a sliver of light open in the darkness. He had made it. The shack. He tried to push himself up, but his arms gave way. He looked up, his vision swimming, and saw a face in the light. It was an apparition, a phantom conjured by the fever, the face from his dreams, the woman who smelled of pine and wild roses. She was here. Real. He did not understand how. He only knew he had to say her name, to make sure she was not just another ghost. He parted his cracked lips, and a single, ragged whisper escaped, torn from the depths of his soul. "Ilara." Then the world dissolved into blackness. Ilara stood frozen, the name hanging in the air between them like a ghost. Jed. It was Jed. He had whispered her name, and then his eyes had rolled back in his head and he had gone still. She was paralyzed, not by fear, but by a tidal wave of emotions so powerful they threatened to drown her. Disbelief crashed into terror. A wild, foolish flood of long-suppressed love warred with the cold. Paralyzing dread of her husband. Marcus. The thought of him was like a physical blow. He was a man of terrible jealousy. He viewed her as his, and any threat to that ownership was met with swift, brutal violence. If he were to find Jed here, hurt and helpless, he would not hesitate. He would kill him, and he would likely kill her, too. Her first, sensible instinct was to shut the door, to slide the bar back into place and pretend this never happened. Let the wilderness have him. It was what he would have done. It was the safe thing to do. Her life was a fragile, carefully balanced thing. And this man, this ghost from her past, would send it all crashing down. She looked down at him, at the blood soaking his side, the pale, waxy color of his skin beneath the dirt. This was Jed, the boy who taught her how to skip stones across Miller's Creek, the man who had kissed her for the first time under a canopy of stars, his touch both clumsy and reverent, the man whose heart she had broken to save him. She had let him go once to keep him alive. She could not. She realized with a terrible, soul-shaking certainty. Leave him to die now. The decision was not a thought. It was a physical act, a deep, primal command from a part of herself she thought had long since been buried. In that instant, she was no longer Marcus Blackwood's resigned wife. She was the girl who had loved Jedediah Stone. It was an act of rebellion, an act of love. It was the most foolish, dangerous thing she had ever done. The immediate reality of her choice was its sheer difficulty. She grabbed him under the arms and pulled. He was a dead weight, heavy with bone and muscle, and she was not a large woman. Her boots slipped on the icy porch boards. She grunted with the effort, her breath pluming in the frigid air. Inch by painful inch, she dragged him across the threshold. His body left a long, ugly smear of mud and blood across the clean, polished floorboards she had worked so hard to maintain. The sight of it, a stain of chaos on her sterile world, sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. Finally, he was inside. She slammed the heavy door shut and dropped the iron bar into its cradle with a deafening clang. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. Her world, once as vast and empty as the mountains outside, had now shrunk to the four walls of this cabin and the monumental, life-threatening secret lying on her floor. For a moment, she just stood there, breathing heavily, her hands trembling. Then, a desperate pragmatism took over. Shock would not help him. Fear would not heal him. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his broken body, unsure of where to even begin. She forced herself to be calm, to assess the damage. The gunshot wound in his side was the worst. The fabric of his shirt was stiff with dried blood, and the flesh around the torn hole was swollen and an angry red. It was infected. It would need to be cleaned, stitched, if she could find the courage. She fetched a basin of water and a clean cloth, with trembling fingers. She started to clean his face. The task was intimate, achingly so. She wiped away the layers of grime and dried blood, revealing the man beneath. The years had been hard on him. His face was leaner, carved with new lines around his eyes and mouth. A faint scar cut through one eyebrow. This was not the fresh-faced boy she had loved. This was a man who had been weathered by the world, hardened by a life she could only imagine. But the curve of his mouth, the stubborn set of his jaw, that was still him. That was still her Jed. She finished cleaning his face and gently pushed the damp hair back from his forehead. He was burning with fever. She knew she had to get him out of his wet, torn clothes and near the fire. The struggle began again. A clumsy, exhausting battle with limp limbs and heavy boots. She managed to get a pallet of blankets spread by the hearth and roll him onto it. He lay there, unconscious, his breathing a shallow, worrying rasp in the quiet room. Outside, the first flakes of snow had begun to fall, soft and white against the darkening windows. They were silent ghosts, come to witness her folly. Alara sank down into a chair, her body aching with an exhaustion that was more than physical. She reached for the rifle Marcus kept propped by the fireplace. It stuck smooth and cold beneath her hands. She laid it across her lap. It felt heavy, a terrible weight of responsibility. She watched the snow fall, watched the firelight flicker across the face of the man who had crawled back from the dead, and grappled with the terrifying, world-altering truth of what she had just done. She had invited her past, and very likely her own death, right through her front door. The cabin became a world unto itself, sealed off from the rest of creation by the falling snow and the secret it held. Time lost its customary shape, no longer measured by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the rhythm of Jed's ragged breathing and the frantic, fearful beating of Alara's own heart. The space, which had once felt cavernous in its loneliness, now seemed to shrink with each passing hour, the log walls closing in, the air thick with unspoken history and the metallic scent of his sickness. Alara's life became a series of stealthy, meticulous tasks. Each morning she would rise before dawn and listen at the door for long minutes, her ear pressed to the cold wood, straining for any sound beyond the whisper of the wind. Her trips to the creek for water were fraught with a new kind of terror. She moved with the quiet grace of a doe, her eyes scanning the tree line, her ears tuned for the telltale crunch of a horse's hoof in the snow. Each bucket of water felt like a stolen treasure, a victory against the ever-present fear. Once a week, a quiet ranch hand named Silas would ride up from the main Blackwood ranch with supplies. On those days, a cold dread would settle deep in Ilara's stomach. She would work for hours beforehand, airing out the cabin to chase away the scent of fever and herbs, hiding any trace of her patient. She would meet Silas on the porch, forcing a calm smile to her lips, making small talk about the weather while her mind screamed with the possibility of discovery. She would ask for an extra tin of coffee or a bit more flour than usual, claiming the cold gave her an appetite, her voice a carefully constructed lie. She lived in constant fear that he would notice the strain in her eyes, the way her hands trembled, and ask a question she could not answer. Inside the cabin, she was a physician of necessity. She boiled rags in the big kettle over the fire until they were clean, the steam filling the small space. She remembered things her grandmother had taught her, half-forgotten lore of the woods. She ventured into the snow-covered forest, her skirts heavy with damp, to search for the tough, stringy bark of the willow tree to boil for his fever, and for the fuzzy leaves of mullein plants to make a poultice for his wound. She carefully rationed the food, stretching the salt pork and beans, knowing they were all that stood between them and starvation if the snows became too deep for Silas to travel. Every sound was an enemy. The groan of a log settling in the wall was the sound of Marcus's boot on the porch. A gust of wind rattling the window pane was the sound of his hand on the latch. At night, she would sit in the chair by the fire, the rifle across her knees, and listen. She was terrified of her husband, of his cold rages and the possessive gleam in his eyes. But beneath the terror, a new feeling had taken root. It was a fierce, stubborn thing, a determination that felt like a fire being rekindled in a place she thought had gone cold forever. Saving Jed was more than an act of compassion. It was an act of defiance. With every spoonful of broth she coaxed between his lips, with every cool cloth she laid on his brow, she was reclaiming a piece of herself that Marcus Blackwood had tried to extinguish. She was no longer just a possession. She was a woman with a purpose, however dangerous it might be. For Jed, the world was a swirling red fog of pain and heat. He drifted on a dark, feverish river, his consciousness a splintered thing. Time was a loop of burning and shivering, of a thirst so profound it felt like his throat was lined with sand. He was trapped in his own broken body, but his mind wandered, untethered, through the landscape of his past. He was a boy again. Standing on the high bank of Miller's Creek, the sun was hot on his back. Ilara was in the water, her dark hair slicked back, her laughter echoing in the summer air as she splashed him. The water was shockingly cold, and he remembered the feel of her hand in his as they pulled themselves onto a sun-warmed rock. The memory dissolved, replaced by another. They were under the big cottonwood tree on her father's land, the one with the crooked branch that looked like an old man's arm. He had just finished a season on a cattle drive and had a pocketful of silver dollars. He had given one to her, a shiny new Morgan dollar. "For our place," he had said, his voice husky with youthful earnestness. "The first piece of it." She had closed her fingers around the coin, her eyes shining. "A promise," she had whispered. These fragments of memory were ghosts that haunted the cabin. In his delirium, he spoke to them. His voice was a low, hoarse mumble, his words slurred and broken. "The water's cold. Ilara, cold," he would whisper, his body shivering beneath the blankets. "Got the coin. For the hearth." Ilara would sit by his side, listening, her heart a tight, aching knot in her chest. Each mumbled phrase was a fresh wound. She tended to his physical agony, cleaning the seeping gunshot wound with whiskey that made him cry out in his stupor. stitching the edges together with a needle and thread from her sewing box, her hands shaking so badly she almost could not do it. But she could do nothing for the pain in his voice. His words, dredged up from the depths of his fevered mind, were a constant reminder of the life they had lost, of the promises she had been forced to break. A profound guilt settled over her, heavy and suffocating. She was saving his body, but she had been the one to shatter his soul. On the fourth day, the fever broke. Jed woke not to the red fog, but to a soft, gray light filtering through the cabin window. The burning in his side had cooled to a deep, throbbing ache. His head felt strangely clear. For a long time, he lay perfectly still, letting the world come back into focus. He saw the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling above him. He felt the scratchy wool of the blanket against his skin. He smelled wood smoke and coffee. He turned his head slowly, wincing as the muscles in his neck protested. And he saw her. She was sitting in a chair by the hearth, her head bowed over a piece of mending in her lap. The firelight cast a soft glow on her face, illuminating the weary lines around her eyes. She was not a dream. She was real. The memories of the past few days were a confusing jumble, crawling, the cold, her face in the doorway. But the reality of her presence was undeniable. He tried to speak, but his throat was raw. The sound that came out was a dry, rasping croak. It was enough. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the small, silent room. The air was thick with the weight of 5 years, with 1,000 questions and a universe of pain. The awkwardness was a physical thing, a chasm that separated his palate on the floor from her chair. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Ilara," he said. His voice was a stranger's, a hoarse whisper. She put her mending aside and rose. Moving to his side, she knelt, her face a mask of careful neutrality. But he could see the storm of emotions in the depths of her dark eyes. She held a dipper of water to his lips, and he drank greedily. When he finished, he lay back, his head spinning with the effort. He looked at her, at the woman she had become. She was thinner than he remembered, and there was a sadness in her that had not been there before. But she was still Ilara. He could see the girl he had loved beneath the sorrowful woman. And the question, the one that had gnawed at him for 5 years, the one that had been the bitter fuel for all his anger and loneliness, rose to the surface, demanding to be asked. Why? The word was barely a breath, but it landed in the quiet room with the force of a gunshot. Ilara flinched as if he had struck her. She looked away, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the fireplace. She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-protection. "Jed, Just tell me why," he pressed, his voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. "I reckon I earned that much. Was it the money? Was Blackwood's name that much more important than what we had?" The old bitterness was there, creeping back into his voice, the familiar poison he had lived with for so long. She turned to look at him then, and he was shocked to see that her eyes were shimmering with tears. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her pale cheek. When she finally spoke, her voice was choked with a sorrow so deep it seemed to shake her to her very core. "It was never about the money," she whispered. "It was about my father." And then the story poured out of her. It was a torrent of shame and regret, a confession that had been dammed up inside her for 5 long years. She told him everything, her words tumbling over one another in her haste to finally give him the truth. She spoke of her father, a good man in his heart, but a weak one, with a love for the turn of a card he could not control. She described how he had fallen into debt, deeper and deeper, until the man holding his markers was Marcus Blackwood. "Marcus never wanted the money. Jed," she said, her voice breaking. "He came to the house one evening. My father was a broken man, just sitting there, staring at the wall. Marcus did not even look at him. He looked at me." She shuddered at the memory. "He had his terms all laid out. He told my father that he would forgive the entire debt, that he would even help him get back on his feet. There was only one condition. She paused, taking a ragged breath. That I would agree to marry him. Jed listened, his mind struggling to process her words. He felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. He said if I refused, Alara continued, tears now streaming freely down her face, he would see my father arrested for fraud. He had papers drawn up. He would take our land, everything we had. He said he would make sure my family was turned out into the street with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And then he looked at my younger brother, Thomas, who was only 15 at the time, and he said he could not guarantee the boy's safety if the family name was disgraced. The threat, veiled but unmistakable, hung in the air of the cabin. Jed's hands clenched into fists at his sides. My mother and father, they just sat there, she said, her voice filled with a lingering disbelief. They were so afraid, so beaten down. They looked at me, and I could see it in their eyes. They wanted me to say yes. They needed me to say yes. It was the only way out. She finally looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. I could not tell you. Jed, I thought about it. I almost rode to find you, but I knew you. I knew your pride. You would have gone after him. You would have called him out. And Marcus would have killed you. He would have had his men kill you and bury you somewhere no one would ever find you. I know he would have, and I could not live with that. So I chose to let you hate me. I broke your heart so that you could at least live. It was the only choice I had. Silence descended on the cabin, thick and heavy. Jed lay on his pallet, the story echoing in his ears, the entire foundation of his last 5 years, the narrative of betrayal that he had built his hardened life upon, crumbled into dust. He had been the wronged man, the jilted lover. It was who he was, but it was all a lie. His anger, the bitter companion that had kept him warm on cold nights, did not vanish. It transformed. It shifted from her and became a white-hot, focused rage, purer and more potent than any hatred he had ever felt. It was a rage directed entirely at Marcus Blackwood, a man who did not just take things, but who broke them for sport. And as he looked at Alara, truly looked at her for the first time since he had woken up, he saw not the woman who had betrayed him, but a prisoner who had sacrificed her own life to save her family, to save him. A profound, crushing guilt washed over him for the years he had spent hating her, cursing her name. He reached out a trembling hand and laid it on her arm. Her skin was cold. Alara, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. I am so sorry. That was all he said, but it was enough. The chasm between them vanished. In its place was a shared tragedy, a shared enemy. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his, her tears falling onto the rough blanket. They stayed like that for a long time, two broken people finding a fragile solace in a truth that was as terrible as it was freeing. In the days that followed, a new, tentative intimacy grew between them. The awkwardness was replaced by a quiet understanding. As Jed slowly regained his strength, he became acutely aware of her every movement. He watched her as she stirred the pot over the fire, the way the firelight caught the stray strands of hair that had escaped her braid. He watched the quiet efficiency of her hands as she rebandaged his side, her touch gentle and sure. She would help him sit up, her arm warm and strong around his shoulders. She would spoon-feed him broth, a simple act that felt more intimate than any kiss they had ever shared. Their conversations were held in hushed tones late at night. When the world outside was asleep, they did not speak much of the past. It was too painful. Instead, they spoke of the people they had become. He told her of the lonely years, of drifting from one cattle drive to another, never staying in one place for long, a solitary man who trusted no one. She told him of her life with Marcus, of the suffocating silence and the gilded emptiness, of learning to be resilient because she had no other choice. They were not the naive young lovers from under the cottonwood tree anymore. The world had marked them both, hardened them in different ways. and the love that was resurfacing between them was not the simple, joyful thing it had once been. It was deeper, more complex, forged in pain and sacrifice, and it was infinitely more dangerous. The desire was there, a palpable current that flowed between them in the small cabin. It was in the lingering glances, the accidental brush of their hands as she passed him a cup, the way their breathing would catch when they found themselves standing too close. But the reality of their situation was a constant, cold barrier. She was a married woman. He was a wounded man hiding in her home. They were living on borrowed time. About a week after his fever broke, Jed felt strong enough to try to stand. Ilara helped him, her shoulder braced under his arm. He pushed himself up, his legs trembling from disuse, his wounded side screaming in protest. But he stood. He was unsteady, gaunt and pale, but he was on his own 2 feet. He let go of her and stood there, swaying slightly. In the middle of the cabin, he looked across the small space at Ilara, who was watching him with a mixture of relief and a new, more potent fear in her eyes. Now that he was healing, a new set of questions loomed. What now? Where could he go? What would become of them? They both knew, in that silent, charged moment, that nothing was resolved. Surviving the ambush, surviving the fever, that was the easy part. The real danger had not even begun. It was out there, beyond the cabin door, and it would be coming for them. The quiet rhythm they had found, a fragile peace built in the heart of a secret, was shattered on a Tuesday. It was the day Silas was due with supplies, and the sight of his lone horse picking its way through the snow was enough to make Ilara's heart seize in her chest. Jed, who was now able to walk the length of the cabin without assistance, saw the look on her face and moved to stand beside her at the window. Silas did not dismount. He leaned down from his saddle, his weathered face grim, and handed Ilara a folded note. "From the master," he said, his voice low and devoid of its usual warmth. "He is coming up for a hunt. Arrives Thursday." The words were simple, but they landed in the quiet room like a falling stone. Thursday. 2 days. Ilara looked from the note in her hand to Jed's face. All the color had drained from her own, leaving her skin the color of ash. She felt a cold, metallic taste of panic in her mouth. The fragile world they had constructed was about to be obliterated. Jed, though his body was still a map of aches and healing wounds, felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal instinct to shield her from the coming storm. He saw the terror in her eyes, a raw fear that he now understood was not just worry, but the dread of a prisoner about to be inspected by her jailer. "We have to get you out of here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You have to be gone before he comes." The 2 days that followed were a frantic, desperate race against time. The simmering tension that had underlined their quiet intimacy boiled over into a shared, focused panic. Their mission was twofold: to get Jed strong enough to survive a journey in the harsh winter landscape, and to erase every single trace of his existence from the cabin. Ilara worked like a woman possessed. She scrubbed the floorboards where his blood had smeared, her hands raw from the lye soap, until the wood was pale and clean. She took the blankets from his pallet and washed them in a tub of melted snow, beating them against a rock by the creek until her arms ached, her breath pluming in the icy air. Every cloth she had used to clean his wound, every spare shirt of Marcus's she had torn into bandages. She fed to the fire, watching until they were nothing but gray ash, destroying the evidence of her rebellion. Jed pushed his recovering body to its limits, his face set in a mask of grim determination. He forced himself to walk back and forth across the cabin, ignoring the fire in his side, pushing through the pain until beads of sweat stood out on his forehead. He did exercises to strengthen his arms, lifting a heavy log from the wood pile, his muscles screaming in protest with each painful repetition. He was fighting not just his own weakness, but for her safety. They barely spoke, their communication reduced to charged glances and short, clipped sentences. The air between them crackled with urgency and a shared, unspoken fear It was during their last night, as they sat by the fire, that she finally told him about the man who was coming. It was not a confession this time, but a warning. She needed him to understand the true nature of the threat. "In town, in Redemption," she began, her voice low. "Everyone thinks Marcus Blackwood is a pillar of the community. He donates money for the new church steeple. He is charming to the ladies at the general store. He speaks of progress and the law. People look up to him." She paused, her gaze distant. "But that is a mask. The real man is different." She told him of small things, incidents that, taken alone, might seem like nothing, but woven together, created a tapestry of chilling control. She spoke of a dinner party where she had voiced a mild opinion on some political matter, disagreeing with him. He had said nothing at the time, had even smiled. But later, when they were alone, his eyes had gone flat and cold, like chips of slate. He had taken her arm, his grip like an iron band, and said, "My wife does not have opinions. She has my opinions. Do you understand?" The bruises on her arm had lasted for a week. "He has to own everything," she whispered, her hands twisting in her lap. "And everything he owns has to be perfect, and it has to fear him." She told him the story of a prize-winning stallion Marcus had bought, a magnificent black horse with a fiery spirit. The horse had thrown him once, in the privacy of their own corral. Marcus had not been badly hurt, only his pride. He had walked calmly into the barn, retrieved a rifle, and had shot the beautiful animal right between the eyes. He had then ordered his men to bury it and had never spoken of the horse again. Jed listened, a cold fury building in his gut. The man she described was not just cruel. He was a tyrant who ruled his small kingdom with absolute power and a temper as unpredictable and deadly as a rattlesnake. "He sees me as his most valuable possession." "Jed," Ilara said, finally looking at him, her eyes wide with a terrible clarity. "He bought me, and if he finds out that his property has been damaged, that another man has been here, in his cabin, with his wife, his rage will not be simple anger. It will be a storm. He will destroy you, and he will destroy me." The stakes had been laid bare. This was not just about hiding a secret. This was about surviving a monster. Thursday came too soon, a cold, gray morning under a heavy sky. Jed was stronger, but they both knew the truth. He was not strong enough. He could not make a long journey through the deep snow and biting wind. He would die out there just as surely as he would die here if Marcus found him. The frantic hope of escape dwindled, replaced by a grim, cornered desperation. It was Jed who found the solution. He had noticed a ring pull in the floor, nearly hidden by the edge of the bearskin rug. It was a trapdoor. Together, they lifted it, revealing a small, dark space beneath the cabin. It was a root cellar, dug into the cold earth, barely 4 feet deep and 6 feet long. The air that rose from it was frigid and smelled of damp soil and potatoes. "I will hide here," he said, his voice resolute. Ilara's face was a study in conflict. "Jed, no, you will freeze. Your wound." "It is the only way." He cut her off, his gaze steady. "He will not stay long. A few days at most, I can manage." There was no time to argue. In the distance, they heard it. The faint but unmistakable sound of approaching horses. A frantic, terrified glance passed between them. This was it. The moment had come. Jed gathered a spare blanket and his knife and lowered himself into the cramped, dark hole. He looked up at her, his face pale in the gloom. "Be careful, Ilara," he whispered. She knelt at the edge of the opening, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. "Just stay quiet," she pleaded. "No matter what you hear, stay quiet." He reached up and squeezed her hand, a silent promise. His touch was warm and real. Then he let go. With trembling hands, she lowered the heavy trapdoor into place, plunging him into absolute blackness. She quickly dragged the heavy bearskin rug back over it, smoothing the edges just as the sound of horses grew loud outside, followed by the jingle of harnesses and Marcus's booming voice. The cabin door swung open, and Marcus Blackwood entered, bringing a blast of cold air with him. He was a large man, tall and broad-shouldered, handsome in a severe, imposing way. He filled the room with his presence, making it feel small and suffocating. "Elara," he said, his voice a smooth baritone that held no real warmth. "The place is cold. Have you not been keeping the fire up?" From that moment on, Elara moved through a waking nightmare. She forced a smile to her lips, a welcoming expression that felt like a brittle mask. "Marcus, I was not expecting you so soon. Welcome. Let me take your coat." She performed the part of the dutiful wife, her movements graceful and practiced. While inside, a silent scream was building. Her every sense was heightened. She was aware of the heavy tread of his boots on the floorboards, just inches above Jed's head. She was aware of the way his cold eyes swept the room, assessing, missing nothing. Below, in the frigid dark, Jed was plunged into a world of sound and torture. The cold was immediate, seeping through the thin blanket and into his bones, waking the ache in his side. But the cold was nothing compared to the agony of listening. He heard everything: the scrape of a chair as Marcus sat down, the clink of a whiskey bottle against a glass, and the voices. He heard the false warmth in Elara's tone, the slight, nervous tremor she could not quite conceal as she asked about his journey. And he heard the casual cruelty in Marcus's voice. Marcus was in a foul mood. He complained at length about the price of cattle, about the incompetence of his foremen, about the general laziness of the men he employed. He spoke of men not as people, but as tools, to be used and discarded. Jed lay on the damp earth, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle of his knife. This was a unique and terrible form of torment, to be helpless, buried alive, listening to the voice of the man who had stolen his life, who had bought his love, who was now sitting at his hearth, drinking his whiskey, breathing his air. Every instinct screamed at him to throw open the door and leap out, to wrap his hands around that arrogant throat. But his promise to Elara held him fast. He gritted his teeth and endured. For her, the afternoon bled into evening. Marcus drank steadily, the whiskey doing nothing to improve his mood. It only seemed to sharpen the cruel edges of his temper. Elara served him dinner, a venison stew she had prepared. She moved carefully around him, a satellite orbiting a dark, volatile star. Fueled by the liquor, Marcus's attention turned to her. His mood shifted from general complaint to a more personal, venomous form of entertainment. "Your father sent his regards," he said, a sneer playing on his lips. "The old fool is actually making a small profit at the general store I set him up in. Amazing what a man can do when his debts are cleared." Elara said nothing, her back to him as she tended the fire. "He should thank you every day. You know," Marcus continued, his voice taking on a taunting edge. "Every single day. He should get on his knees and thank his daughter for saving him from rotting in a jail cell. You did save them, did you not, Elara? A fine, noble sacrifice." Jed's blood ran cold. He could hear the venom, the delight Marcus took in reminding her of her chains. He imagined the look on her face, the quiet, dignified pain she would be showing. The urge to act, to protect, was a physical force, a pressure building in his chest until he could barely breathe. Marcus seemed to sense her unease, her nervous energy. It was like a predator sensing fear. "What is the matter with you tonight?" he snapped. "You are as jumpy as a cat. Is my company not good enough for you after your weeks of solitude?" He stood up, his heavy footsteps moving toward her. "Or perhaps the stew is burnt. Is that it? After all I provide for you, a decent meal is too much to ask." What happened next was swift and brutal. Jed heard a sharp, cracking sound, the unmistakable, ugly sound of flesh hitting flesh. It was followed by Ilara's choked cry, a sound of shock and pain that was cut off almost immediately. In the darkness of the root cellar, something inside Jedediah Stone broke. The promise he had made, his rational thought, his fear, it was all incinerated in a single, blinding flash of protective rage. The sound of that slap, of her pain, was more than he could bear. It was a line that could not be uncrossed. With a roar that was more animal than human, he threw his body upward. The heavy trapdoor flew open, sending the bearskin rug tumbling aside. He exploded from the cellar, a specter of righteous fury, his eyes blazing in the firelight. The scene was a chaotic tableau of motion and shock. Marcus spun around, his hand still raised, his handsome face a mask of stunned, disbelieving fury. Ilara was pressed against the stone of the hearth, her hand to her cheek, a dark red mark already blooming on her pale skin. She screamed his name. "Jed!" A sound that was both a warning and a cry of utter despair. Jed stood before them, gaunt and pale from his ordeal, but infused with a strength born of pure rage. He held the knife in his hand, its blade gleaming. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Marcus recovered, his shock turning to a dark, murderous rage. "You!" he snarled, his eyes locking onto Jed. He lunged. Marcus was a powerful man, bigger and heavier than Jed, and not weakened by a fresh gunshot wound. The confrontation was short, savage, and brutal. Jed, driven by desperation, met his charge, stabbing wildly with the knife. But Marcus batted his arm aside with contemptuous ease. He slammed a fist into Jed's wounded side, and the world went white with pain. Jed crumpled, the knife skittering across the floorboards. Marcus was on him in an instant, his hands closing around Jed's throat, squeezing the life from him. Jed's vision began to tunnel, black spots dancing before his eyes. Above him, Marcus's face was contorted with a triumphant, possessive fury. "She is mine!" he bellowed, his thumbs digging deep. As Marcus raised a fist to deliver the final, killing blow, Ilara acted. There was no hesitation, no thought. All the fear, all the years of quiet resignation, were burned away by a single, clarion purpose. She would not let him kill Jed. She grabbed the first thing she could find, a heavy, cast-iron skillet resting on the hearth. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she swung it with both hands, bringing it down on the back of her husband's head with all her might. There was a sickening, dull thud. Marcus's body went rigid. The pressure on Jed's throat vanished. The triumphant look on Marcus's face was replaced by one of pure, vacant surprise. He swayed on his feet for a moment, then crumpled to the floor like a felled tree, unconscious. The cabin was plunged into a deafening silence, broken only by Jed's ragged, desperate gasps for air. He pushed himself up, his throat raw, his sides screaming. Ilara stood frozen, the heavy skillet still clutched in her white-knuckled hands. They both stared down at the still form of her husband, lying in a heap on the floor. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the scent of fear, whiskey, and the faint, coppery smell of blood. They were no longer just hiding a secret. They had committed an act of violence. They were no longer just prisoners, trapped by circumstance. They were fugitives. For a long moment after Marcus fell, the only sound in the cabin was the ragged hiss of Jed's breathing and the frantic, silent drumming of Ilara's heart. There was no relief, no triumph. The sight of her husband's unconscious form on the floor did not bring freedom, only the stark, cold certainty of a new and more terrible reality. The fire crackled in the hearth, oblivious, casting dancing shadows that made the scene even more grotesque. Jed pushed himself to his feet, one hand pressed to his bruised throat, the other to the searing pain in his side. "He will not be out for long," he rasped, his voice raw. The words broke Ilara's paralysis. She dropped the heavy skillet with a clang that echoed in the unnatural quiet. He was right. When Marcus woke, His rage would not be human. It would be a force of nature, boundless and without mercy. His power, his influence in the territory, meant that the law would be his weapon. The story would be simple and damning. His unfaithful wife and her murderous lover. They would be hunted not as people, but as animals. "We have to run," she said, her voice a low, trembling whisper that held a core of steel. Flight was not a choice. It was the only instinct left. The hour that followed was a blur of frantic, purposeful chaos. Adrenaline was a fire in their veins, burning away pain and exhaustion. They moved through the small cabin, which had been a sanctuary and a prison, and was now a crime scene they had to flee. Jed, though every movement sent a jolt of agony through him, gathered the essentials. He took the rifle Marcus kept by the fireplace and a box of ammunition from the gun cabinet, which he broke open with the butt of the gun. He found a leather satchel and stuffed it with what little food they could carry: a half loaf of bread, a slab of salt pork, a small bag of dried apples. He added a tinder box, his knife, and 2 heavy wool blankets from the bed. While he worked, Ilara was undergoing a transformation. She went to a large wooden storage chest at the foot of the bed, a chest that held her husband's hunting clothes. Without a moment's hesitation, she pulled off the fine wool dress she wore, the uniform of Mrs. Blackwood. She let it fall to the floor in a heap, a discarded skin. From the chest, she pulled on a pair of practical men's canvas trousers, rough and strange against her skin. She added a flannel shirt and a heavy, sheepskin-lined coat. The clothes were too big, but they were warm and offered a freedom of movement her own garments never could. As she laced up a pair of sturdy leather boots, she was not just preparing for the wilderness. She was shedding an identity, consciously and completely rejecting the life she was leaving in ashes behind her. When she turned back to Jed, her braid undone and her dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders, she was a different woman. The resigned bride was gone, replaced by someone leaner, harder, and more determined. Jed stopped his packing for a moment, his eyes meeting hers. In that shared look, there was a grim understanding of the path they had just chosen, a path from which there was no turning back. He nodded once, a quick, sharp gesture. She nodded back. He slung the satchel over his shoulder and took the rifle. Ilara extinguished the main lamp, plunging the cabin into the flickering gloom of the firelight. They took one last look at the man on the floor, a dark, still shape in the center of the room. Then, together, they slipped out the door and into the unforgiving, snow-filled night. The wilderness received them with a cold, brutal indifference. The world beyond the cabin was not a sanctuary. It was a new kind of cage, vast and perilous. The snow was deep, coming up to their knees in places, and the wind was a physical force, howling through the pines and driving the frozen flakes into their faces like tiny needles. The landscape, which might have been beautiful in the daylight, was a terrifying maze of black and white under the moonless sky. The cold was a constant, gnawing enemy. It found its way through the layers of their clothes, seeping into their bones, making their muscles ache and their movements sluggish. And in this new, wild world, the dynamic between them underwent a profound and immediate transformation. In the cabin, he had been the helpless patient, and she, the constant, watchful caregiver. Now, out here, their roles were reversed. He was their only hope. Jed's years on the trail, the hard-won knowledge etched into his very being, was all that kept them alive. He was no longer just a man. He was a guide, a protector. He moved with a purpose that defied his injuries, his eyes scanning the terrain, his mind constantly working. He led them into the dense timberline, where the trees offered some small protection from the wind. He taught her how to walk in his footsteps, to conserve her energy. When she stumbled, he was there to catch her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. He pushed himself to the brink, his jaw tight with pain he refused to acknowledge, his focus entirely on her safety. Ilara, in turn, became a survivor. The pampered wife of a wealthy rancher, the woman who had lived in a world of polished wood and fine china, disappeared into the snowy darkness. In her place was a woman of astonishing resilience. She learned to read the subtle signs of the trail that Jed pointed out to her. A bent twig, the direction of the wind-drifted snow. She learned to be quiet, to listen to the sounds of the forest, to move with a stealth she never knew she possessed. The exhaustion was a heavy weight on her limbs, the hunger a hollow ache in her stomach, but she endured it all without a single word of complaint. The struggle stripped away every last pretense between them. They were completely dependent on each other. Two solitary souls bound together by a shared act of violence and a desperate flight for their lives. This was not the sweet, youthful romance of their past. This was a bond forged in the crucible of survival, a raw and absolute trust that was more powerful than any promise made under a summer sky. For days, they traveled, moving mostly at night and resting during the day in hidden, secluded spots. They crossed half-frozen rivers, the icy water a shocking agony that stole their breath. And they climbed up into the wind-scoured mountain passes where the air was thin and the world felt barren and hostile. Jed taught her how to build a snare for rabbits, and her heart pounded with a fierce, primitive pride the first time they found a catch. She learned how to handle the rifle, its weight solid and reassuring in her hands, its loud report a jarring but necessary violence in the quiet woods. One night, a blizzard descended upon them, a roaring wall of white that obliterated the world. Jed found them shelter in a shallow cave, a mere overhang of rock on the side of a granite cliff. They huddled deep inside, wrapped in the 2 wool blankets, the wind shrieking outside like a banshee. The cold was so intense it felt like a living thing, trying to claw its way into their small sanctuary. It was in this frozen, isolated bubble that they finally spoke of things other than survival. The fire Jed had managed to start with the tinderbox cast a warm, flickering glow on the cave walls. They sat close, their shoulders and legs pressed together for warmth, a physical closeness born of necessity that blossomed into something more. He looked at the dark bruise on her cheek, a stark reminder of the violence that had set them on this path. He reached out, his touch impossibly gentle, and brushed his thumb over the discolored skin. His eyes were filled with an unspoken regret. "He will not ever touch you again," he said, his voice a low, fierce promise. She took a small cloth and the last of the whiskey from a flask he carried and insisted on rebandaging his side. Her movements were deft and caring as she cleaned the angry, stitched wound in that small, fire-lit space, sealed off from the world by the raging storm. They were the only 2 people alive, the past and the future, with all their ghosts and fears, seemed to fall away, leaving only the present moment. "When I was crawling," he said, his voice barely a whisper above the storm, "I did not know where I was going, not really. My mind was, it was a mess, but I kept seeing something, a patch of sun, and I could hear you laugh." He looked at her, his gaze direct and filled with a raw vulnerability she had never seen in him before. "That memory of you, Ilara, it was the only thing that kept me moving. It was all I had left." Tears welled in her eyes, hot against her cold skin. "And for 5 years," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion, "I have been the one who was dead. Those years with Marcus, living in that beautiful house, it was like being buried alive, a slow, quiet death of the soul." She looked at their hands, his torn and calloused, hers resting on his arm. "The night I opened the door and found you, helping you, keeping you safe, that was the first time in all those years I felt like I was alive again." In that moment, their love was truly rekindled. It was not a ghost of the past, but a living, breathing force, born not of youthful dreams, but of shared tragedy and a fierce, desperate will to survive. He leaned in and kissed her, and it was not a kiss of passion, but of profound connection, a silent acknowledgement of all they had lost and all they had just found in each other. But the world outside their small cave had not forgotten them. Miles behind them, Marcus Blackwood was very much alive, and his fury was everything they had feared. The perspective shifted, following the hunters. Marcus rode at the head of a posse of 10 men. His head was bandaged, a white strip of cloth against his dark hair, and his face was a mask of cold, murderous rage. His pride, the very core of his being, had been shattered. He had been struck down in his own home, by his own wife, for a common trail drifter. The humiliation was a poison in his blood. He had assembled his men with ruthless efficiency. They were not lawmen, they were hard men, hired guns and ranch hands whose loyalty was to his money, not to justice. In the town of Redemption, he had used his wealth and influence to spin a masterful, slanderous tale. He was the respected husband, the victim. Jedediah Stone was a known outlaw, a violent vagrant who had broken into his home, attacked him, and kidnapped his terrified wife. He offered a bounty, a staggering sum for the time, for Jed's capture, dead or alive, and for the safe return of Alara. The story spread like wildfire through the territory. Every homesteader, every trapper, every traveler they might have turned to for help was now a potential enemy, eager for the reward and believing they were doing the work of the law. Marcus had not just sent men after them. He had turned the entire world against them. Jed and Alara saw the evidence of the hunt. During the day, from high vantage points, they would sometimes see the smoke of their pursuers' campfires, a thin gray plume rising from the valleys below, a constant, sickening reminder that they were not escaping, but only staying one step ahead. They were not just running from a man, they were running from the entire world he commanded. Their flight became a desperate, grueling ordeal. They were exhausted, their food was nearly gone, and the constant fear was wearing them down. Finally, after weeks of running, they reached what seemed like the end of the line. They stood on the edge of a high, seemingly impassable ridge. Before them was a sheer drop, a cliff face of crumbling rock and ice. Behind them, the valley sloped downward, a vast, snow-filled expanse of trees. And from that valley, echoing in the cold, clear air, came a sound that made their blood run cold. It was the baying of hounds. Marcus had brought dogs. They were trapped, exhausted, nearly out of food, with a cliff at their backs and a hunting party closing in from below. Jed looked at Alara, his face grim, and she saw in his eyes the terrible weight of their situation. There was nowhere left to run. A decision had to be made. Would they keep trying to climb, to find an impossible path forward? Or would they turn and fight for their lives? The baying of the hounds echoed off the rock face, a hungry, terrifying sound that seemed to claw at the air. Trapped. The word was a cold stone in Alara's stomach. Before them, a sheer drop into a chasm of shadows. Behind them, a posse led by a monster, closing in for the kill. There was nowhere to go. But Jed was not looking down at the posse. He was looking up, his eyes narrowed, scanning the precarious wall of scree and loose rock that loomed above the trail they had just taken. He saw what he was looking for, a large, precariously balanced boulder, a keystone holding a field of smaller rocks in place. It was a desperate gamble, the kind of wild chance a man takes only when he has no other cards to play. "Get back," he ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. He pushed Alara toward the relative safety of a solid granite outcrop. "Cover your head." He unslung the rifle. He was not a great marksman, but he was steady. He took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and aimed not for the boulder itself, but for the smaller rocks that served as its chalk. The rifle cracked, the sound shockingly loud in the thin mountain air. The bullet whizzed past the boulder. He cursed under his breath, levered another round into the chamber, and fired again. This time, the bullet struck home, shattering a piece of the supporting rock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan that seemed to come from the mountain itself, The massive boulder shifted. It tilted, slowly at first, and then with a terrible, gathering speed. It plunged downward. It struck the trail and exploded, taking a cascade of rock and earth with it. A river of stone and debris roared down the mountainside, a chaotic, thundering avalanche that shook the very ground they stood on. It poured over the path below, a gray, churning wave of destruction, and did not stop until it had filled the narrow pass with tons of impassable rock. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant, confused yelping of the hounds and the faint, angry shouts of men. They had bought themselves time, but they were now stranded on the high, treacherous ridge, with their only way back completely destroyed. "We have to cross," Jed said, his face grim in the pale light. The ridge was a knife's edge of wind-blasted rock and ice, with a dizzying drop on either side. It was a harrowing, terrifying crossing. The wind tore at them, trying to rip them from their handholds. They moved slowly, inch by agonizing inch, a test of raw physical endurance and absolute trust. He would go first, finding a secure position, then reach back for her, his hand a firm, unwavering anchor in the chaos of the wind. She followed without hesitation, her fear a cold knot inside her, but her faith in him absolute. They were a single unit, their survival tied together with every painful step. It took them hours, but they made it. On the other side, they collapsed, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and relief. Below them lay a place that did not seem to belong to the world they had just escaped. It was a secluded, almost forgotten valley, a perfect bowl of green cupped between the surrounding peaks. A small creek, impossibly blue, snaked through a meadow dotted with pine and aspen. The air was still and quiet. It was a pocket of the world that seemed untouched, a sanctuary. Their descent into the valley was slow and careful. As they reached the valley floor, the sense of peace was palpable. The silence here was not the oppressive, lonely silence of Marcus's cabin. It was a living, breathing quiet, filled with the gentle murmur of the creek and the rustle of the wind in the trees. And there, nestled in a grove of aspen, they found it, a long-abandoned trapper's cabin. It was a dilapidated thing, its roof sagging in the middle, its door hanging from a single leather hinge. But it had 4 walls and a stone chimney that was still standing. It was shelter. It was a reprieve. The weeks that followed were a period of fragile, unbelievable peace. The constant motion and gnawing fear of their journey gave way to a quiet, settled rhythm. They were no longer fugitives, running for their lives. They were partners, building a life in a hidden world. The narrative of their days slowed, marked by the simple, domestic tasks of survival. They worked together to repair the cabin. Jed, using his knife and a hatchet he fashioned from a flat stone, cut down young pines to patch the roof. Ilara, using skills she had not thought of in years, chinked the gaps between the logs with a mixture of mud and dried grass, her hands becoming chapped and calloused. They were not the hands of Mrs. Blackwood anymore. They were her own. Jed's snares kept them supplied with rabbits, and he managed to bring down a small deer with a rifle, giving them precious meat. They lived as the land provided, a simple, honest existence that felt both entirely new and deeply familiar. This was a glimpse of the life they had once dreamed of, the life that had been stolen from them. They fell into a natural cadence, working together with an unspoken understanding, a partnership that was more profound than the youthful passion they had once shared. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire in their small, repaired cabin. The world outside, with its monsters and its bounties, felt 1,000,000 miles away. In the safety of their hidden valley, they finally allowed themselves to be vulnerable. They shared stories, not of their shared past, but of the lonely, separate years. He spoke of the trail, of the endless empty plains and the fleeting camaraderie of the cattle drives, of a loneliness so deep it felt like a constant chill in his bones. She spoke of the crushing emptiness of her marriage, of the suffocating silence of a grand house, of the slow, methodical erosion of her own soul. And one night, something remarkable happened. Jed told a story of a comical mishap on a cattle drive, and Alara laughed. It was not a polite, restrained sound. It was a genuine, full-throated laugh, a sound of pure, unburdened joy. The sound was so strange and precious in the small cabin that it made Jed stop and stare at her, a slow, wondrous smile spreading across his own face. It was the first time either of them had truly laughed in years. Their love, rekindled in the crucible of survival, now had the space to deepen and heal. The intense, desperate desire that had been a silent current between them in Marcus's cabin was now allowed to find its voice. Their coming together was not a frantic, passionate act, but a slow, tender exploration of the connection they had reforged. It was an act of profound intimacy, a quiet confirmation that after all the pain and all the loss, they had found their way back to each other, whole and unbroken in a way that mattered. It was about healing the scars, both visible and invisible, that the world had left on them. But their fragile sanctuary was not meant to last. It was inevitably breached, not by the baying of hounds or the crack of a rifle, but by the appearance of a single, old man. He seemed to materialize from the trees one afternoon, a grizzled, stoop-shouldered prospector with a wild white beard and eyes as sharp and wary as a hawk's. Jed had the rifle in his hands in an instant, his body tensed, placing himself in front of Alara. The old man held up his empty hands, his movements slow and deliberate. "Easy there, son," he grumbled, his voice like rocks grinding together. "Did not mean to spook you. This here has been my valley for nigh on 20 years. Did not figure on finding anyone else calling it home." The initial encounter was tense. The prospector's name was Silas. He was suspicious of them, and they were terrified of him. For days, they watched each other from a distance. Two solitary camps in a hidden world. But Silas was a man who existed on the fringes of society. He lived by his own laws and had a deep, abiding mistrust of powerful, wealthy men who bought up land and fenced in the wilderness. He saw the hunted look in their eyes, and it resonated with a part of his own solitary soul. Slowly, cautiously, he began to approach them, sharing a bit of his coffee, a plug of his tobacco. He saw the way Jed looked at Alara, the fierce, protective love in his eyes, and he saw the quiet strength in her. He began to trust them, and then he began to talk. It was through Silas that they learned the true, monstrous scope of Marcus Blackwood's cruelty. He told them stories as they sat around a shared fire, his voice a low growl. He spoke of a family named Miller, who had a small homestead on a creek Marcus wanted. Marcus had engineered a cattle stampede that destroyed their crops and then had foreclosed on them when they could not pay their debts. He told them of a young ranch hand who had dared to stand up to Marcus in a saloon, and who was found a week later with a broken back at the bottom of a ravine. The law had called it an accident. "Blackwood owns the law in this territory," Silas said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the fire. "He owns the judge, the sheriff, the whole damn lot of them. He is a cancer on this land, poisoning everything he touches." Then, one night, Silas asked Jed where he had come from, how he had gotten that ugly gunshot wound in his side. Jed told him a shortened version of the story, of an ambush on a cattle drive. Silas listened, his eyes narrowing. He asked which drive, which trail, boss. When Jed told him, the old prospector fell silent for a long time. "I heard about that," he finally said, his voice grim. "Heard it from a fella who was one of the shooters. He got drunk in redemption and started bragging." Silas looked Jed straight in the eye. "That was not no random ambush. Son, that was a paid job. Marcus Blackwood found out you were working that drive, that you were in the territory again. He paid those men a handsome price to make sure you never rode out of those hills alive. He wanted to erase the last piece of his wife's past." The words struck Jed with the force of a physical blow. It had not been random. It had been personal. Marcus had not just stolen his life 5 years ago. He had actively tried to end it. His survival had been an accident, an unforeseen complication in Marcus's neat, orderly world. That knowledge was the turning point. It changed everything. Their desperate flight for survival suddenly seemed small, selfish, simply escaping, disappearing into the wilderness to live out their lives in hiding, was no longer enough. Marcus would go on. He would continue to ruin families, to steal land, to beat and kill anyone who stood in his way. He was a poison, and as long as he held power, others would suffer as they had. Their personal struggle had evolved into something larger, something darker. It had become a fight for justice. And with that realization came a terrible, tragic understanding. This was a fight they might not survive. Facing Marcus was not just about winning their own freedom. It was about stopping a monster. They could no longer run. The decision was made in the quiet, grim silence that followed Silas's revelation. They would stop being the hunted. They would become the hunters. Silas, seeing the cold, resolute fire in their eyes, nodded slowly. "If you are going after that devil," he said, "you will need help, and I know this land better than he does." The final days in their peaceful valley were spent in preparation for war. With Silas's detailed knowledge of the local geography, they formulated a plan. They would not face Marcus and his men on open ground. They would lure him into a trap, a place where the terrain itself was a weapon. The location they chose was an old, abandoned mine on the far side of the valley, a place Silas called the Crimson Peak Mine for the red-hued rock that stained the mountainside. It was a treacherous, forgotten place, a maze of tight tunnels, unstable shafts, and deep, swallowing shadows. It was the perfect place for an ambush. The mood in their small cabin became somber and resolute. They spent their last night in the relative safety of their sanctuary, the love between them now tinged with the tragic, beautiful sadness of what might be their final hours together. It was a night of quiet confessions and poignant intimacy, a last, perfect moment of peace before they willingly walked into the heart of the storm. As Ilara lay in Jed's arms, listening to the steady beat of his heart, she knew they were no longer just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for the Millers, for the young ranch hand, for every soul Marcus Blackwood had crushed under the heel of his boot. And that sense of purpose, that grim, unwavering courage, was the only thing that could carry them into the darkness that awaited them. The dawn that broke over Crimson Peak was cold and gray, mirroring the dread that had settled in their hearts. The mine entrance was a dark, gaping mouth in the red-stained mountainside, promising nothing but shadow and violence. The air was still and thick with anticipation. For 2 days, they had worked, their movements economical and silent, transforming the abandoned mine into a carefully constructed trap. Silas, with his intimate knowledge of every treacherous tunnel and unstable shaft, was their architect. He directed them with quiet, grim authority. They set a deadfall just inside the main entrance, a massive web of timbers and rock propped up by a single, crucial support that could be kicked out at the right moment. They blocked side passages with debris, creating a funnel that would force Marcus and his men deeper into the mine, along a predetermined path. They were not planning a battle. They were orchestrating a series of ambushes, using the darkness and the claustrophobic tunnels as their primary weapons. The plan was to separate their enemy, to disorient them, to let the mine itself devour them one by one. Ilara was not a bystander in this grim preparation. The resilience that had blossomed during their flight had hardened into a steely resolve. She was armed with a pistol taken from Marcus's cabin, and she knew how to use it. Her role was specific and dangerous. She would be positioned deep within the network of tunnels, at a junction where she could create a diversion or, if necessary, block a retreat. She moved with a focused calm that belied the terror churning inside her. She was no longer a victim of fate. She was an agent of it. Their preparations were complete. They took their positions, Jed and Silas near the entrance, hidden in the shadows of an alcove, and Ilara deeper within the earth's cold embrace. Then They waited. The waiting was a torment, a silent stretching of minutes into hours, where every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Finally, they signaled as planned. Silas had ridden out before dawn to a ridge overlooking the valley. He fired a single shot from his rifle, a lonely crack that echoed through the wilderness. It was the bait, a signal that the fugitives were cornered, making a last, desperate stand at the old mine. They did not have to wait long. Marcus, arrogant and blinded by his obsessive need for revenge, swallowed the bait whole. They heard the sounds first, the baying of the hounds, the shouts of men, the thunder of horses. A small, hand-picked group of his most ruthless men rode into the canyon leading to the mine. Marcus was at their head, his bandaged head a stark white against the grim backdrop. He dismounted, his face a mask of triumphant fury, and led his men into the darkness of the mine. The trap was sprung. The moment the last of his men was inside, Jed kicked the support beam. With a deafening roar, the deadfall collapsed, sealing the entrance with an impenetrable wall of rock and timber. They were locked inside. Panic erupted from the new darkness, a chorus of curses and confused shouts. What followed was not a heroic gunfight. It was a desperate, ugly, and chaotic game of cat and mouse in absolute blackness. Jed and Silas became ghosts, their knowledge of the tunnels their greatest advantage. They moved through crawl spaces and hidden vents, their moccasined feet making no sound on the rock floor. The fighting was savage and close quarters. A lantern would be lit, and a shot would ring out from the darkness, extinguishing it. A man would scream, a brief, terrified sound that was abruptly cut off. Gunshots echoed and re-echoed in the enclosed spaces, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. It was a nightmare of confusion and sudden, brutal violence. Silas, using a length of chain he had found, would whip it out of the darkness to snag a man's legs, pulling him down to be dispatched by Jed's knife. They were not soldiers. They were survivors, using every dirty, desperate trick they knew. But their fight for justice came at a tragic cost. They had managed to neutralize 3 of Marcus's men, their bodies left in the silent tunnels. The remaining men were now moving cautiously, clustered together. Jed and Silas needed to separate them again. Silas volunteered to create a diversion, to draw them down a false tunnel. It was near the junction where Alara was hidden. "Keep them busy for a minute," Silas had whispered to Jed. "That is all I will need." He slipped away into the darkness. A few moments later, a shout echoed from a side tunnel, followed by a gunshot. Marcus and his remaining men, smelling blood, charged in that direction, but one of them, lagging behind, heard a small sound, perhaps a pebble dislodged by Alara's boot. He stopped, turning toward the small alcove where she was pressed into the shadows. He raised his lantern, its light a growing, terrifying circle on the rock wall. Just as the light was about to find her, Silas appeared as if from nowhere, leaping from another passage and throwing himself at the man. He was old, and the man was young and strong. As they struggled, the man's rifle discharged. The shot was deafening in the tight space. Silas cried out, a sharp gasp of pain, and fell. The man, seeing his chance, raised the rifle to finish him, but Jed was there, a blur of motion from the main tunnel. His knife flashed once, and the man crumpled beside the old prospector. Jed knelt beside Silas. The old man was clutching his chest, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. His breathing was a shallow, wet rattle. "Go!" Silas rasped, his eyes finding Jed's in the dim lantern light. "Finish it, for all of us." His eyes glazed over, and the last breath sighed out of him. Jed felt a hollow, aching grief. The old prospector, their reluctant, grizzled ally, had sacrificed himself to save Alara. His death was a grim, final underscoring of the terrible price of their stand. The final confrontation took place in the heart of the mountain, lured by the sounds of the struggle. Marcus and his last two henchmen had found their way to the mine's main cavern. It was a vast, dark space, dominated by a rickety wooden platform that extended out over a deep, black chasm, an old mine shaft that plunged into the bowels of the earth. It came down to Jed and Marcus. The two henchmen were dispatched in a brief, frantic exchange of gunfire, one taken down by Jed, the other by a shot from Elara, who had followed them, her face a pale, determined mask in the gloom. And then there were two. Their fight was not one of tactics or skill. It was the culmination of 5 years of stolen love, of simmering hatred, of profound injustice. It was a raw, brutal, bare-knuckle brawl on a precarious stage. They were two men stripped of everything but their primal rage. Marcus was stronger, his blows like hammers, fueled by a lifetime of arrogance and power. But Jed was faster, quicker, fueled by a righteous fury for Elara, for Silas, for every life Marcus had ruined. They grappled on the rickety platform, the old timbers groaning under their weight. Marcus landed a heavy blow to Jed's wounded side, and Jed staggered back, his vision blurring with pain. Marcus lunged, his hands reaching for Jed's throat again, but as they struggled on the precarious edge, one of the henchmen, not as dead as he had seemed, stirred. He painfully raised his pistol, taking aim at Jed's back. "Jed, look out!" Elara's scream echoed in the cavern. From her position at the edge of the cavern, she fired her pistol. The henchman's head snapped back, and he went still for good. The distraction, the momentary shift in Marcus's attention, was the only opening Jed needed. He drove his shoulder hard into Marcus's chest. The fight ended not with a clean shot, but with a desperate final struggle. Their combined weight was too much for the old, rotten timbers. With a terrible, splintering crack, the platform beneath them gave way. Jed, reacting with pure instinct, threw himself backward, catching a thick, supporting beam at the edge of the chasm, his fingers scraping against the rough wood. But Marcus, his face a mask of shocked disbelief, had nothing to grab. For a single, eternal moment, he hung in the air. Then, with a final, guttural cry of rage, he plummeted into the swallowing darkness of the mine shaft. His reign of terror was over, ending in the deep, black earth he had so desperately sought to own. The immediate aftermath was one of stunning, deafening silence. Jed hung from the beam, his body screaming with pain, his lungs burning. Elara scrambled to his side, her hands grabbing his, helping him pull himself back onto solid ground. He collapsed, severely beaten, emotionally shattered, his body a single, throbbing bruise. They were alive, they were grieving for Silas, and for the first time, they were truly free. They emerged from the darkness of the mine into the soft, gray light of dawn. They were bruised, bloodied, and utterly exhausted, but they were breathing. They did not linger in that place of death and reckoning. They took what supplies they could from the dead men's horses, food, ammunition, and 2 strong mounts. They left the Crimson Peak mine and its dead to the silence of the mountains, and they rode away without looking back. Their resolution was not a simple, happy ending. The scars of their ordeal, both the ones on their skin and the deeper ones on their souls, would always be a part of them. They were still fugitives, the bounty on their heads still active, even if the man who issued it was gone. The death of Silas weighed heavily on them, a constant, sad reminder of the cost of their freedom. They could not return to redemption, or to any part of their old lives. They traveled for weeks, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and their past. The narrative voice of their life became quieter, more reflective. They rode through territories where the names Blackwood and Stone meant nothing, anonymous travelers searching for a place to rest. The final scene of their story takes place nearly a year later. They found a new place, a new territory in the vast, open expanse of the West. They found a piece of land on a quiet creek, a place not unlike the hidden valley they had lost, and they began to build. The work was hard, They felled the trees themselves, hewing the logs with borrowed tools. They built a small, simple cabin, not a monument to wealth, but a shelter built with their own 4 hands. The life was one of constant labor, but it was honest, and it was theirs. The story ends on a quiet, poignant image. Jed and Alara stand together in the evening light, looking out over their small plot of land as the sun sets, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. There are lines of sorrow and hardship etched on their faces. They are no longer the boy and girl who dreamed of a life together. They are a man and a woman who have walked through the darkest of valleys and have come out the other side. But in their eyes, and in the way they stand close, his arm around her, there is a deep and abiding peace. Their love, which had begun in youthful innocence, had been tested by betrayal, prejudice, death, and tragedy. It had been reforged in the fires of violence and the crucible of survival. And it had brought them here. It was not a perfect love, not an easy one, but it was real, and it was enduring. Theirs was an ending of hard-won, realistic hope, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and to the enduring power of a love strong enough to overcome the darkest of tragedies. Thank you for gathering around the campfire with us tonight. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.